have been discussing about early Greek philosophers, and we continue today to discuss about Democritus and his theory of knowledge. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, for Democritus, he talks about two types of knowledge. The first is the legitimate, and the second is the obscure. This term true or legitimate knowledge is again a derivation from the Greek term gnosis. The source is reason, their characteristics are rational, abstract, reliable. Obscure knowledge is derived from the Greek words koitios. The source is senses and characteristics are subjective, misleading, superficial. Now, Democritus says that obscure knowledge is that which comes from sense perception, that is to do with taste, sight, touch. Democritus believed this is often deceptive because it deals only with appearances. Secondary qualities, example color, smell, are not real but caused by the motion and arrangement of atoms. Our senses can be influenced by the body's condition, distance, perspective, or context. There is a very famous quote of Democritus which says, quote, "By convention sweet, by convention bitter, in reality only atoms and the void," unquote. This is taken from the fragment as reported by Sextus Empiricus. Here, however, Democritus did not fully reject sensory experience. He, however, thought it was a starting point, useful but must be corrected or interpreted by reason. Means sensory or sensation is the starting point of knowledge, but then once we claim to be knowledgeable, we must limit our dependence on sensation and rely more on reason. The other second source of knowledge is called as the legitimate knowledge, which he says arises through rational inference and mental abstraction. It helps us to understand the true nature of reality. It discerns necessary causes behind appearances. It recognizes that qualia is, what things feel like, are subjective constructs. The quotation from the Democritus fragment DK 68 says, quote, "In reality we know nothing, for truth is in the depths," unquote. So this famous line shows Democritus' epistemic humility. Now, what is this epistemic humility? Epistemic humility is the truth that is hidden beneath appearances. What we perceive is surface level. To reach truth, we must penetrate deeply through reason. Then Democritus talks about a balance between rationalism and empiricism. Democritus was a proto-rationalist but not a dogmatic one. He acknowledged that the senses are necessary for inquiry, yet insisted they must be subject to critical reasoning. This anticipates later philosophers. Now, some of these later philosophers are Plato, who had dismissed sense data, only reason yields truth or forms. Aristotle, who had viewed that empirical data is important but should be organized by reason. Descartes, who distrusted the senses. He says truth comes from clear, distinct ideas. Locke or Hume, who are empiricists and argued that all knowledge originates in sense experience. And Kant, synthetic a priori, where reason and experience work together. So we see that Democritus' stance is a balanced stance. Empirical reality is not wholly false, it is just not the ultimate truth. Reason reveals the underlying structures, which is atoms in motions. Now, what are the implications of these remarks? A. Early theory of indirect realism, which is we do not perceive the world as it is, but only its effects on our senses, which are caused by atoms heating sense organs. B. Theory of emergent phenomena. Qualities like sweetness or color emerge from atomic configurations, not from intrinsic properties. C. Foundational insight for scientific method, which starts with observations but proceed with inference, hypothesis, and critical analysis. So, Democritus's theory of knowledge, which is epistemology, is one of the earliest and most nuanced attempts in Western philosophy to distinguish between sensory knowledge and rational knowledge. He divides knowledge into two fundamental types, which we had just about mentioned as the obscure knowledge, where he talks about it as dark knowledge, and the source, he talks about it as, that which emanates from sense perception, which is sight, hearing, smell, touch and taste. The features are subjective, deceptive and incomplete, and it is based on secondary qualities, things like color, taste, warmth, smell. These qualities do not exist in reality but are effects produced in us by the arrangement and motion of atoms. So, rightly, he says that what we perceive, for example, as sweetness of honey is not an objective property of the substance. These are illusions or approximations caused by how atoms interact with our sense organs. Our senses are necessary for survival but not for discovering the truth. And the limits is that we cannot reveal the essence of reality, for it leads to conflicting perceptions. What is hot to one may be cold to another. It needs to be corrected or interpreted by reason. Thus, the other source of knowledge, which has been the true or legitimate knowledge, is called as the genuine or authentic knowledge. The source has been rational thinking, logic and intellectual inference. The features are objective and reliable, and it seeks to understand the underlying structure of reality, where atoms in motion within the void. It is the method of science and philosophy, deducing what is not visible through reason. So, Democritus says, quotation within quote, "In truth, we know nothing, for truth is in the depths," unquote. This suggests that truth lies beneath appearance. Only through rational inference can we grasp the mechanistic order of the cosmos. Even though we start from the senses, we must transcend them to reach genuine understanding. Now, if we talk about the metaphysical consequences of Democritus's philosophy about the source, we see that the genuine knowledge is sourced from sense perception, as displayed in the PPT here, via empiricism or empirical. The legitimate knowledge is through reason or logic or inference. Reliability of the first one is low, whereas of the legitimate one is high. The content of the first one is to do with appearance and secondary qualities, whereas for the legitimate knowledge it is to do with atoms, void, reality. The nature of the first knowledge is subjective and relative. Of legitimate, it is objective, universal. The role of illegitimate knowledge is the starting point. The legitimate knowledge is the end goal of inquiry. And the example of illegitimate knowledge could be the apple is red and sweet. Legitimate knowledge, the qualities are effects of atom arrangement. So, we must understand at this juncture that why is this distinction of knowledge between epistemologically legitimate and illegitimate knowledge important? This distinction is important because a first major theory of indirect realism. We do not perceive objects directly, we perceive effects caused by atomic arrangements on our senses. Secondly, the early foundation for science, which is that it emphasizes that appearances can be misleading. It encourages hypothesis and rational explanation for phenomena. Third is that it echoes in later philosophy, where we see Plato distrusting senses, favoring reason, which is the world of forms. Descartes, where he was absolutely clear that cogito ergo sum, where basically it's only reason can bring certainty. Kant divides knowledge into phenomena, which is appearances, and noumena, things in themselves. Nyaya epistemology in India, it distinguishes between pratyaksha, which is perception, and anumana, which is inference, but unlike Democritus, accepts both as valid sources. So, Democritus offered a proto-scientific and proto-rationalist epistemology. He valued the senses but recognized their limitations. He emphasized the true knowledge lies beyond appearances and must be uncovered by reason. His distinction between legitimate and illegitimate knowledge prefigures the methods of empirical science and philosophical analysis. So, the interesting part about the ethics and psychology in Democritus' philosophy, now that we have learned about the two distinctions of knowledge, legitimate and illegitimate, when we talk about the psychology or the ethics of it, we see that for him, the goal of life is cheerfulness, a stable state of inner peace. He advocated moderation, self-control, contentment, and intellectual contemplation. It is heartening to note that if Heraclitus was called as the dark, Democritus was called as the light for his cheerful banter. Ethics for Democritus was not based on divine law, but on rational harmony and human flourishing. Democritus's ethical philosophy is one of the most refined and human-centered systems in early Greek thought. Though he is more famously known for his atomic theory, his ethics provide a rational, secular, and psychologically insightful approach to the good life. Now, when we talk about Democritus's ethics in detail, we know about euthymia, which is cheerfulness or tranquility of the soul. The core principle is that the goal of life is euthymia, which is a state of calm, cheerfulness, and inner stability. As it is quoted in fragment B19 within quote, euthymia arises from moderation and balance and from keeping the soul in harmony, unquote, which means that it is not pleasure in the hedonistic sense. It is a balanced inner condition free from fear, superstition, extreme emotions, and irrational desires, which is similar to ataraxia or tranquility in Epicurean and Stoic thought. So, if on the one hand we have euthymia, on the other hand we have ataraxia. Now, when they talk about moderation and self-control, they say that excessive indulgence leads to instability, suffering, and loss of euthymia. Rational regulation of desires is essential. He warns against being enslaved to pleasures and encourages measured living. So the quotation, the man who chooses the pleasant over the good suffers harm, the good brings its own joy. Now, when we talk about contentment and simplicity, we see that for Democritus, wealth and luxury do not guarantee happiness. True richness lies in being satisfied with little and free from anxiety, as is clear from his quote where he says, "Happiness does not reside in cattle or gold. The soul is the dwelling of the divine," unquote, which means that this anticipates the ethical teachings of Epicurus, who also claimed that simple living leads to lasting joy. Now, rationalism in ethics, when we talk about it, we see that ethics is grounded in human reason, not divine command. Morality for Democritus arises from understanding what is good for human flourishing, eudaimonia, not fear of punishment or divine will. As the quote says, quote, "Man fashioned the idea of the gods according to their own image as they saw them in dreams," unquote. This is a radical secularization of ethics for his time. Now, to talk about the psychological insight of Democritus, we see that he did offer early psychology of emotion. He recognized the conflict between irrational impulses and reason. Happiness is achieved by bringing thoughts, actions, and desires into rational alignment. He thought ethical behavior improves not just society, but one's mental health and inner peace. Ethics is not innate, it requires education, practice, and habit. He emphasized the importance of virtue or arete and moral character. Children should be educated to love what is just and good, not simply punished. And Democritus offered early psychology of emotion, and he realized that the essence to be happy ought to be the only psychological essence in a true human being. And thus he says that ethical behavior improves not just society but also personally, mentally, and inner wise. Now, if we look at the PPT as being displayed here, the comparison to the various ethical schools, we see in Democritus, the goal of life is eudaimonia, which is to be cheerful, calm. Epicurus was ataraxia, which is tranquility. For Democritus, ethics is based on reason and harmony. For Epicurus, it was avoidance of pain. For Democritus, the view of pleasure was pleasure is fine if moderate. Epicurus, pleasure is the highest good. For the Stoics, again, if we see at the PPT here, we see that the goal of life is living in accord with nature. For Aristotle, it was eudaimonia or flourishing. For the Stoics, again, ethics is based on rational virtue. For Aristotle, it is both virtue and function. For Stoics, the view of pleasure is equal to indifference. For Aristotle, pleasure is equivalent to natural accompaniment of virtue. So, eudaimonia, for a quick explanation, is to do with inner harmony, not disturbed by irrational fear or craving. Moderation is to do with avoid excess in food, wealth, emotion, and reason is the guide to ethical action and self-governance. Further, self-sufficiency is a true happiness that comes from the soul, not external things. Education is ethical behavior must be taught and practiced, and compassion is empathy towards others that strengthens inner calm and social harmony. So, we see that Democritus's ethics stands as a rational, humanistic and practical moral philosophy, a psychological insight into human well-being long before modern psychology arrived. So, we can see Democritus as a bridge between pre-Socratic naturalism and later ethical systems like Epicureanism and Stoicism. His ethics encourages us to live simply, think clearly and act justly, not for reward or divine favor, but because doing so leads to the deepest kind of human happiness. Thus, perception, if we quickly remind what we had been doing so far, he had said that perception is caused by the interaction of the atoms from objects with our sense organs. For example, vision is due to the emission of images from objects. About soul, he had said that the soul is material which is composed of particularly fine round atoms like fire. Mind, he says, is not immortal as it is composed of atoms and dissolves at death. Further, if we see, for Thales, if you remember, the arche was water and thus he was a monist. For Anaximenes, the arche was air and he was again a monist. Heraclitus was fire, and Logos, he was the flux was his type. Parmenides, it was the unchanging being, he too was a monist. Empedocles was four elements plus love and strife, he was a pluralist. Democritus also viewed atoms and void as arche, and his type was an atomist, pluralist plus materialist. So, Epicurus, we see, had developed and moralized atomism, adapting it for an ethical philosophy. Democritus preserved and popularized atomism for Latin audiences. Modern atomic theory in physics owes conceptual debt to Democritus, and materialism, reductionism, and early scientific rationalism owe foundational ideas to him. Thus, Democritus and Leucippus, with their formulation of atomism, led a profound and far-reaching legacy, not just in the history of philosophy, but also in the development of modern science and secular ethics. Their ideas were taken up, transformed, and transmitted across Hellenistic, Roman, medieval, and modern intellectual traditions. So, it is interesting how they have been disseminated through times across ages, and their impact on modern science and philosophy is also worth mentioning, where we know that while Democritus's atoms are philosophical and not empirical, however, his basic assumptions prefigured modern science, something like the indivisibility of matter, the idea that macro phenomena arises from micro level interactions, the concept of reductionism, where explaining complex entities by their simplest parts. So a modern atomic theory like Dalton or Rutherford or Bohr is not a direct continuation, but the conceptual ancestor is surely Democritus. And also about enlightenment, materialism and rationalism, the mind-body debate, consciousness studies and neuroscience often draw from the Democritean reductionist paradigms explaining mental states in terms of physical processes. So we see philosophical legacy of Democritus to have disseminated in materialism, vis-a-vis the concept of even determinism as of that matter, where they believe that all motion and change are governed by necessity. So if we talk about the epistemology now, as we had mentioned already, he had mentioned about the legitimate knowledge and the illegitimate or the obscure knowledge. If one was guided by reason, the second was by senses. And the later rationalistic empiricist debates, for example like Descartes versus Locke, owes a lot to our Democritean stance. So if we are talking about the foundational themes, let us understand that if naturalism is to talk about a universe explained without divine causes, reductionism talks about whole, which is equivalent to sum of parts, mechanistic explanation talks about motion and rearrangement, not purpose, empiricism and rationalism talks about balance of sense, perception and reason, scientific atheism talks about no supernatural beings needed to explain life, and all these are continuation of our Democritus. So be it on the impact on philosophy of science, it influenced debates on causality versus say teleology, emergentism versus reductionism, realism versus instrumentalism in science. And again, from the ethical and humanistic influence, as mentioned, he has been the precursor to secular humanism, where ethical life based on reason, harmony and moderation and not divine command was his stance, and his ideas resonate with utilitarianism, which was the greatest good, is equivalent to rational peace. And there also has been mappings of the Stoic and Buddhist tranquility ideals with Democritus' ethical theory. Thus, Democritus' legacy stretches across millennia, from pre-Socratic naturalism to Enlightenment rationalism and into the conceptual foundations of modern science. By, as the very famous quotation of Democritus, within quote, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention color, in reality only atoms and void, where Democritus remains, for such reasons as a visionary of materialist metaphysics, as a founder of scientific worldview, is a philosopher of peace, reason and human freedom. So Democritus has been an interesting early Greek philosopher, and his contribution to Greek philosophy has been immense. He has been a visionary thinker who laid the groundwork for scientific materialism, and his atomistic metaphysics, ethical rationalism and naturalistic worldview were revolutionary for his time. Though his writings are lost, the fragments we have continue to inspire discussions on the nature of reality, knowledge and human well-being. Thank you so much. We shall be continuing more in our next lecture on the early Greek philosophers. Thank you.